What if an entire generation of American kids grew up with nobody checking on them at all, and it turned them into the most self-sufficient people alive today? Think about it. Boomers get blamed for the economy. Millennials get mocked for everything from napkins to avocado toast. Gen Z can't look up from their phones. Every generation gets a headline, a punchline, a think piece. But sandwiched right in the middle, there's a whole generation almost nobody talks about. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. They're the coworker who gets everything done without ever making noise about it. They're your parent who raised you but never once needed the credit for it. They're the people who built most of the technology we're all addicted to, and yet barely have a presence on it themselves. And here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. Their psychology might be the most fascinating, most misunderstood psychological profile of any living generation. By the time this video ends, you're going to understand exactly why. And it starts with one image that defines this entire generation more than any other single thing. They were latchkey kids. And I don't mean a handful of them occasionally let themselves in after school. I mean this was standard. Millions of kids every single day for years. Picture it. It's 1978. You're 8 years old. The school bus drops you off at the corner. You walk home past the same houses, the same dog barking behind the same fence. You reach under your shirt and pull out a key, hanging from a shoelace around your neck, because that's where it lives all day at school too, and you unlock the door to an empty house. No parents home, no babysitter, no iPad to FaceTime your mom and check in. No Ring doorbell pinging her phone the second you walk in. You are completely, entirely alone. You pour yourself a bowl of cereal. You turn on the TV, all 4 channels of it, and you wait. That's it. That's the afternoon. By the late 1980s, U.S. Census Bureau data put the number of regularly unsupervised kids between the ages of 5 and 13 at over 2 million, and other contemporary estimates, counting less formal arrangements, ran several million higher than that. Whatever the exact count, this was not some isolated situation happening to a handful of unlucky families. This was an entire generation, in real time, learning the exact same lesson over and over again. Nobody's coming to save you. Figure it out yourself. And that empty house didn't just teach independence, it rewired how their brains actually process the world. Here's what I mean by that. It taught them that consequences are real and they are immediate. You couldn't text your mom for permission because there was no texting. You couldn't Google what to do because there was no Google. You made a decision on your own and you lived with whatever came from it, good or bad. And when your parents finally did get home, discipline wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a gentle, feelings-focused family meeting where everyone processes their emotions together. You messed up, you got punished, end of story. No appeals process, no negotiation. Psychologists have a term for growing up inside that kind of environment, a high-contingency environment. It means actions and outcomes are connected directly, with no buffer, no cushion, no adult standing between a choice and its consequence. When a child's brain develops inside that kind of pressure, it adapts. It starts running constant simulations. If this happens, then what happens next? And after that? Because it has to. There's no one else doing that thinking for you. That's exactly why Gen X as adults often has this almost eerie ability to see a problem coming before it actually arrives. It's not pessimism, it's not paranoia. It's a brain that spent its entire childhood being trained to think 2 and 3 steps ahead because the 8-year-old version of them didn't have any other option. But here's where it gets darker, because the empty house was only the first lesson. The second one came from watching the adults in their lives. Gen X watched their parents preach one thing constantly and then live the complete opposite. All the talk at the dinner table about commitment, about loyalty, about doing the right thing no matter what. And then divorce rates exploded through the 1970s and 80s, more than doubling compared to the generation before. For a huge number of Gen X kids, commitment was a word their parents said out loud and then broke, right in front of them, before they'd even finished middle school. Then came the second betrayal, the workplace. They watched their fathers give 30 years of their lives to a single company. 30 years of loyalty, of showing up, of doing exactly what they were told to do. And then a pink slip during the next round of downsizing. No ceremony, no gold watch. Just gone like none of it had ever mattered. The message landed hard and it landed early. The system will eventually betray you. People will eventually let you down. Promises are conditional, not guaranteed. Psychologists call the coping mechanism that grows out of this defensive pessimism. Gen X just calls it Tuesday. They hope for the best, sure, but they plan for the worst, because in their lived experience, the worst shows up on a fairly regular schedule. I want to be really clear about something here, because it's easy to misread this as just cynicism. It's not. It's pattern recognition, built from years of consistent data. And it created a kind of emotional armor, one that can make Gen X look detached from the outside, when really they're just protecting themselves from a disappointment they've already learned, painfully to expect. And that same armor is exactly why you barely see this generation on social media. This isn't a technology gap. Let's be very clear about that. Gen X didn't just witness the internet get built, they built huge parts of it themselves. They understand these platforms better than almost anyone using them today. The reason they're missing from social media is something else entirely. They grew up when privacy was the default, not the exception. If you did something embarrassing as a teenager in 1985, maybe 10 people on Earth ever found out about it. Maybe it got brought up once, at one party, and then it quietly faded into nothing. There was no permanent digital record, no searchable trail, no screenshot that outlives your reputation by 20 years. To Gen X, the idea of broadcasting your daily life online doesn't feel liberating. It feels dangerous, exposed, vulnerable, in a very specific way that younger generations, raised on visibility, don't always instinctively feel. They learned early, the less people know about you, the safer you actually are. So they watch, they lurk, they read the comments, they scroll the feed, they observe everything happening, but they very rarely participate. Not because they can't, because they still remember exactly what real privacy felt like, and they're not trading it away for a handful of likes. Then there's the irony that runs even deeper than the privacy instinct, and it explains their entire sense of humor. Gen X essentially weaponized ironic detachment as a survival tool. Everything's a joke. Nothing's that serious. Keep it light, keep moving, and whatever you do, don't let anyone see that you actually care. Where does that come from? Try growing up during the tail end of the Cold War. These were kids who did nuclear fallout drills in elementary school. Teachers would calmly walk an entire classroom of 7-year-olds through the process of ducking under a wooden desk in case the bomb started falling, as if plywood could somehow protect anyone from a thermonuclear strike. Adults presented total, civilization-ending annihilation as a real standing possibility that could happen on any given Tuesday. And then, in the very same breath, don't worry, everything's fine. Go back to your spelling test. When you're raised inside that kind of split reality, a real existential threat delivered with forced, practiced calm, you learn to hold two completely contradictory things in your head at once. You learn to laugh because the alternative is falling apart. And you learn to keep a careful emotional distance from almost everything, because attachment starts to feel like setting yourself up for pain you can already see coming. But despite every bit of that, the neglect, the instability, the constant mixed signals from the adults around them, Gen X developed one of the most understated, impressive work ethics of any generation alive. They don't talk about it. You will not find them writing hustle culture manifestos on LinkedIn about 5 a.m. wake-ups and grind culture. They just show up and they do the work. Silently. This was forged early through jobs that sound almost prehistoric by today's standards. Paper routes at 5 in the morning, where a 12-year-old was personally, individually responsible for delivering the news to hundreds of houses, on time, in the dark, in the cold, no exceptions. Bagging groceries, running a cash register at a fast food counter when the system went down, and you had to calculate change in your head, correctly, with a line of impatient customers watching. These weren't resume builders. They weren't extracurriculars designed to look good on a college application. They were raw, unfiltered introductions to adult responsibility, handed to actual children. They watched their own parents get chewed up and discarded by corporate America. So they never fully bought into the idea of company loyalty. But they became obsessed with something else instead: competence, being genuinely, provably valuable. They learned early that they can't control whether a layoff eventually comes for them, but they can control whether they're the very last person anyone in the building would ever choose to let go. So they build that reputation, one shift and one project at a time, without ever asking anyone to notice. And that leads to one of the strangest, most defining contradictions at the very core of GenX psychology. They are simultaneously the most independent generation alive, and one of the most fiercely, unassumingly collaborative. They will almost never ask you for help. They've been solving their own problems since they were 8 years old, alone, in an empty house. Asking for help was simply never built into the equation. But if you need help, they show up. No drama, no public post afterward about what a great friend they are. They just do it, and then they move on like it never happened. This comes from something very specific. When the adults in their lives weren't reliably present, friendships had to step in and fill that gap. Your friend group became your real family out of pure necessity, not sentiment. And that loyalty never left them, not even decades later. Now let's talk about authority, because their relationship with it is complicated in a very particular way. Gen X respects competence, not titles. If you earned your position through actual skill, through real demonstrable knowledge, they will follow you anywhere, no questions asked. But if you're just an executive who talks a good game and clearly doesn't know what they're doing, zero patience. They will smile politely in the meeting and then work around you for the rest of the project without ever making it a confrontation. They question authority because they watched incompetent people in positions of power make catastrophic decisions their entire lives, out in the open, on the evening news. Watergate, Iran-Contra, the AIDS crisis, handled by people in power with what can only be described as criminal negligence. Economic policies that systematically gutted the American middle class while the people responsible faced no consequences at all. They learned young. The people in charge don't automatically know what they're doing, and blind obedience in their experience is for suckers. Economically, Gen X got hammered, and it happened in waves, at 3 completely different points in their lives. The oldest members of the generation graduated straight into the early 1990s recession, right as they were trying to start careers. The ones in the middle got hit by the dot-com crash at the turn of the century, watching entire careers and savings evaporate almost overnight. And nearly the whole generation, at very different life stages, got hit again when 2008 detonated the global economy, with Gen X households reported to have lost roughly 45% of their savings in that crash alone. They've been economically traumatized repeatedly at nearly every major life stage, which is exactly why so many of them run multiple income streams today without ever really announcing it. Not because they're naturally entrepreneurial by personality, but because they've learned viscerally in their bones that nothing lasts. Every job is temporary. Every company will eventually restructure, downsize, get acquired, or simply disappear. This created real psychological weight that most of them never fully unpack. Comparative research on coping styles across generations consistently finds that Gen X leans heavily on problem-solving and pragmatic self-reliance, while younger generations lean more on seeking social support. Not because Gen X doesn't have people around them who'd help, because asking still feels, somewhere deep down, like weakness, like failure. They were raised to handle things alone, and that programming runs deeper than most of them even realize. It makes them incredibly capable in a genuine crisis. But it also means they often struggle with vulnerability, with truly letting people in, with admitting out loud that they might actually need help. Their relationship with information is different too, and this is a part of the Gen X story that almost never gets told. Before Google existed, knowledge had weight. It cost you something to obtain it. Gen X kids spent real hours physically inside libraries, flipping through card catalogs by hand, hunting for the one specific book that might actually have the answer they needed. Information required effort, time, physical labor, and because of that, what they learned stuck differently. When knowledge costs you something real to acquire, your brain holds on to it more permanently than when the answer is one search away and forgotten 30 seconds later. That same principle shows up in how they interact with the physical world. They learn to fix things with their own hands because that's simply what you did. Bike chain slips off? You flip the bike upside down, get grease on your fingers, and you figure it out yourself. TV goes fuzzy? You smack the side of it until the picture clears up. Nobody called a technician. You became the technician by necessity at age 10. This built a kind of mechanical intuition in them, a deep, lived-in belief that with enough patience and the right tool, you could take apart almost any problem in the physical world and put it back together again. And now, that same generation is raising their own kids inside a completely different universe. Helicopter parenting, constant supervision, social media documenting every single moment of a child's life, shared instantly with dozens of relatives. Gen X parents largely gave their kids the attention they themselves never received growing up. But quietly, a lot of them worry they've overcorrected, that they might be raising kids who are softer, more dependent, more anxious without constant reassurance close by. Because in the Gen X worldview, a worldview built brick by brick from an empty house, a shoelace key, and a childhood spent learning that nobody's coming, being visible has always meant being vulnerable. And vulnerability, in their lived experience, is exactly what gets you hurt. Here's the truth, and it's worth sitting with. Generation X might be the very last generation that truly remembers what it means to be bored. To sit alone with your own thoughts, with nothing to distract you. To solve a real problem without instantly reaching for an answer that already exists. Ready-made, online. They're not better than any other generation. They're not worse either. They were simply shaped by a very specific, narrow window in history, a moment when the old world was already dying, but the new one hadn't fully arrived yet. They are the bridge generation, the middle child of modern history. And bridges don't get parades. They don't get recognition ceremonies. They're just there, quietly holding everything together, expecting absolutely nothing in return. And honestly, that might be the single most Gen X thing about all of this. Not caring whether anyone notices, not needing the credit, just getting it done and moving on to whatever comes next. If this resonated with you, if you're Gen X and you finally felt seen, or if you're from a different generation and this just made you understand your parents, or that one coworker who never talks about themselves, subscribe. I genuinely appreciate you being here.